Welcome back to 30 at 6. Heather Lynette Sinclair is running for Maryland State Senate in District 36. This is the seat currently held by Senator Steve Hershey. It includes southern Cecil County, Queen Anne, Kent, and Caroline counties. We should note before we get started that we've reached out to Senator Hershey's campaign and we're working on organizing an interview with him. Heather, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little about your background.
About 6 years ago, I went into therapy, and I wanted to address some of the issues that I was having at my late 20s. One of them being depression. My childhood history, I grew up in severe poverty, domestic violence, and I'm also a juvenile sex trafficking survivor. So I was trafficked right here in Maryland from 16 to 18 years old, and I never really dealt with any of those issues until after I was married and I had children, and I started to realize that it was eating me from the inside out. So I went into therapy, and at first it started working out really well for me, and then about 2 months in, I started to realize that some things were not right. A couple of months after that, I was sexually assaulted by my therapist.
Wow.
So when I went to report him, I found out he was a violent convicted felon who had spent 4.5 years in prison for aggravated assault on a child. So my first question was, how did a violent felon get a license to be a therapist in the first place?
That's a great question.
So when I started doing my homework and I realized that Maryland was not requiring criminal background checks for mental health professionals, and they were also not requiring them for medical doctors. So I contacted, I believe the delegate at that time was Delegate Mike Schmiegel, who is the former delegate from 36.
Right.
I contacted him, and he put in a bill for criminal background checks, and it passed the first year. And after that, after seeing that I made a difference, there's just really nothing like it. So really, I think I started out wanting to just change a few things to protect people. And the other bill was to make it a crime for when a mental health professional sexually harasses or sexually exploits a patient during treatment. That is already a crime in 31 states, but it is not a crime in Maryland.
Wow.
So once I realized that was not a crime, because my former therapist never faced any criminal prosecution whatsoever. As a matter of fact, he was allowed to surrender his license to avoid criminal charges.
Right.
And that's pretty common. What I found out in my research is that it's really common, and it's really common across the country. So that's kind of put me on my journey of, wow, this needs to change. And I put out a website, and as soon as I did that, I was contacted by thousands and thousands of people just like me who had experienced healthcare professionals who had violent records, or they had been harmed by a professional, whether physically harmed or sexually, and nothing was ever done. It stayed at the licensing level. So I was able to put in legislation in multiple states, in Delaware, in Virginia, in West Virginia, and a couple of other in the middle of the country, as well as Maryland. And some of them passed, and some of them didn't. So that was how I got started. Was I guess you could say that I was a victim, and I was an angry victim. I wanted to know how this happened to me. And
So what compelled you to run for office?
That, I think, because it took me, the one bill, Lynette's Law, still has not passed in Maryland. It did pass in West Virginia in 2016. So I've had success in multiple states in being able to pass healthcare bills. And along with that, lobbying in Annapolis, it's totally different than someone would think. But lobbying in Annapolis gave me a front row seat to how the legislature really works versus how you're taught that it works.
Right.
So in that process, I started learning about a lot of different issues and a lot of different bills that were going through the legislature. And from my life experience, I saw things that we were not getting right. A lot of the bills that dealt with the homeless population, for example, because I was homeless. So I have experience there, and I was seeing some of these bills passed with the homeless population that weren't necessarily effective. The same thing again with trafficking, which has now become a very political issue. So again, I think we're still getting it wrong. And just from my experience, both personal experience and legislative experience, what I got to see was we passed a lot of feel-good bills for elections rather than passing them and getting them done right the first time.
So to switch gears just a bit, why do you believe that you're a better choice for voters in our district than the incumbent Senator Hershey?
I think I'm the better choice because I don't think we have great representation in Annapolis for this district. I don't think we have had it for some time. Senator Hershey on a personal level, I'm sure he's a really great guy. But as far as being a senator, he is not effective. So usually, and Senator Hershey, it's not just Senator Hershey, but usually elected officials do not post bills. They do not post votes. They do not post anything to give voters information about how they vote on things or their bills. For example, I've pulled up a lot of his bills. I've pulled up all of his voting records. He's not effective.
What do you mean when you say that?
He cannot get legislation passed. The biggest ones are funding. So he cannot bring in funding to the district. So he's been elected since 2010. I think that's quite a long time for him to establish relationships and build a rapport and what's called political capital to be able to pass legislation regarding funding. So he hasn't been totally ineffective. The majority of his bills that pass are alcohol related, which is great. It's fine. I have nothing against alcohol bills, but this district is right now, this district in particular is facing a huge opioid epidemic.
Right.
So we need focus there and we need funding for that issue.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. So the election day is November 6th. Early voting begins October 25th.